Our world in 2024 is quite different than the world of 1800. Technology has played only a part in that massive change. What has played a really big part has been how human beings have changed how they view themselves. We take for granted today the idea of subjectivity, the idea that each individual human being is, well, different, a unique individual with their own subjective perceptions. This was not always the case in both Western and non-Western societies. Human beings traditionally have just been seen as humans. We're all basically the same. Now, there's some rationale behind that. We are basically much more similar than we are different. But it was Immanuel Kant who in the late 1700s opened a door with his revolutionary insight that our perceptions conform to our mental structures. He called it the categories of understanding. And the implication of Kant's new doorway toward understanding human perception was that reality conforms to our minds, and our minds are more, far more, than purely passive perceivers. Kant didn't really follow up on this realization that he had. The German idealists moved the ball forward, and I did a separate video on them. Who really changed how we view ourselves, how we view how we perceive the world, especially in how we perceive ourselves, came down to the existentialists. Now, existentialism, when I say that, you usually think of people like Jean-Paul Sartre and novelists like Albert Camus. And yes, were they existentialists? Sure. But the real beginning of existentialism was the beginning of subjectivity and individualism. And those two philosophers were Soren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, and Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher. They brought forward the idea that we are each individuals. And as individuals, we are, more than anything else, subjective perceivers and creators of our own being, our own lives. First, Soren Kierkegaard. And yes, it's Danish, so though it looks like Kierkegaard, it's Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard was a brilliant thinker. He could look at any question, any issue, think of it in multiple different ways, and come up with an entirely new way of looking at it. And unlike most philosophers, he tried to reach non-philosophers, non-academic people. And that's because he wasn't interested in impressing other philosophers. He thought other philosophers were kind of full of themselves and rather dead-minded, which really is still the case. But Kierkegaard wanted to reach people because we have to live life. We don't live in theory. We don't live in speculation. We live in real life. Most of Kierkegaard's writings were about life and how life must be lived, must be experienced. He was responding and reacting against the prevailing philosophy of his time that had reduced the individual to a mere cog in the machine. Now, that had always been the case, going back to Plato, going back to the very beginnings of philosophy in Western civilization. The human being, the individual, wasn't really an individual. They were simply a part of humanity, a part of society, a part of the nation state. And Hegelianism, from Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, taught that the individual in the 1800s was only able to find freedom if and when that individual understands their place in the larger nation state. Human beings, Hegel said, were nothing more than part of a grand historical process. And that rankled Kierkegaard. It went against every fiber of his being, and he wanted to wake people up to how it went against every fiber of their being. We are human beings, and who we are and who we should be, those are the questions that were central to Kierkegaard's life, and by extension, to his philosophy. So instead of the perception of human progress as being on the grand scale, Kierkegaard said we need to look at what my life is. Who am I? And who am I supposed to be? How should I live my life? Kierkegaard was a Christian, but in a very different way than how most of us think Christians are. Although Kierkegaard pointed out that if you look back at the Christian story, at who Jesus is portrayed as being, he was quite the individual, quite the rebel. And indeed, Kierkegaard was quite the rebel himself. And the problem with rebels is that so few want to be associated with them. And as Kierkegaard pointed out, people don't really want to be associated with Jesus the radical. They want to be associated with the church, which had, in Kierkegaard's opinion, reduced Jesus to mere theory, mere speculation. Christianity is just this rational, friendly, cozy thing. And Kierkegaard points out that's not just religion, that's all of life. People just go through the motions. People do not choose to be individuals. Kierkegaard made a distinction between the subjective and the objective. And this is so important to understanding what he was trying to do. We exist. We are beings, and we are ourselves. And we are free to choose our beliefs. We are free to choose thought systems. We do not have to conform to what we are told. And this is a very important issue for him. Our decisions shape who we are. And thus, Kierkegaard saw human beings, all of us, as alienated from our own nature. Kierkegaard said, we are the cause of our alienation when we choose to simply conform, choose to simply follow along. Kierkegaard's main concern is freedom for the individual, and not the empty freedom that many philosophers have talked about. Freedom is more than simply expressing, more than just simply saying what's on your mind. It's being free. And if you say that's obvious, well, maybe it is. Maybe it is for us. And if it is for us, these ideas of subjectivity, of being yourself, of the freedom to be who you are, is because of philosophers like Kierkegaard. Still to this day, people, including you, yes, you, prefer meaningless routine and immersing yourselves in the objective environment around yourself. We call this society, and there's a lot of good that comes from society. We learn from society. Society helps us grow when there's justice within society. But you, yes, you, oftentimes just go with the meaningless routines that society tells you to perform to avoid your own subjectivity and your own freedom and the need to commit to yourself rather than to society. And everyone does this, Kierkegaard says. This goes way back, he says, and only a few brave souls fight against it. Hegel had placed individual human minds within the absolute mind that he called Geist, or spirit. According to the Hegelian system, we can and should actively engage in reasoning about philosophical questions. But the goal of our critical reflection was, for Hegel, to understand the mind of Geist, a kind of godlike figure, which is the logical structure of the universe. And Kierkegaard rejected this totalizing narrative. We can't, through logic, understand the cosmic mind and everything in it. But Kierkegaard saw this Hegelian notion of we will rationally understand the universe as just pure hubris, pure arrogance. Kierkegaard understood that human knowledge is quite limited and thought that what we really need to do is understand our own limits of our own understandings. Those limits are there, and what really limits us is the fact that we have only subjective perception. For Kierkegaard, it's always about the individual. And this was sorely lacking in Hegelianism, but in all of philosophy and in all of society. Politics doesn't talk about the individual. Philosophy does not talk about the individual. Kierkegaard talks about the individual. In blindly following the traditions and systems of the world, we are avoiding the reality that we humans are beings who must choose and act. Our day-to-day lives are filled with dilemmas that require us to make decisions. Now, some of these dilemmas, if you will, are relatively insignificant. What shall I have for dinner tonight? Where shall I go tomorrow? What movie should I see? But other decisions are life-changing. Should I go to university? Which university should I go to? Should I marry this person? What should I do with my life? We agonize over big decisions, worried that we will make the wrong choice. But Kierkegaard wrote in his book Either Or that if you marry, you will regret it. If you do not marry, you will also regret that. Now, what he means is that we are always capable of reflecting on and seeing the negatives of any choice we make, because we can only really understand our choices, our lives, by looking back at them. The problem, of course, is that while our lives can only be understood backwards, we out of necessity have to live our lives forward. We should not reduce our lives to a series of binary choices, though, because life is more dynamic than that. Part of that dynamic is that we will always be aware that we could have made different choices. We could have lived our lives differently. And the series of choices that we have made have created so many different opportunities, so many differing outcomes for us. And that's why he emphasizes subjective knowing over objective knowing. Throughout history, philosophers had believed that the primary problem of epistemology, of how we understand things, was how to rise above individual subjectivity to acquire objective truth. And Kierkegaard completely reverses this. For him, the primary task in our life is how to become more aware of our own subjective life. And he proposed the radical notion that our natural tendency is to hide behind and underneath this cover of objectivity, to just accept the systems that are given to us, to conform to what we are told to believe. We do this, Kierkegaard says, to avoid the difficulty of making our own decisions. Kierkegaard makes the stark distinction between following the crowd and being self-directed. We can come to truth only when we are self-directed, when we arrive at our decisions through our own experiences, through our own values. That is because truth is subjectivity. Now, we're all taught truth is objective, right? If something is true, it's objectively true. It's universally true. And that is a type of truth. We're not denying that. And Kierkegaard doesn't deny that. There probably are objective truths, but that's not the point. Any objective facts are truth only when they are taken in and owned by an individual. The word subjective has two meanings. Most philosophers and people focus on the bad kind of subjectivity, when personal interests and biases corrupt one's ability to perceive and judge matters correctly. In many matters, for example, like grading a student's assignment, we want the professor to make objective decisions rather than biased ones. And we often associate objective with fair and balanced, and subjective with unfair and biased. But there's also a good meaning of subjective, and that is related to a subject, a person. And philosophers often use the word subject to refer to a human as a being who perceives and acts. And that is how Kierkegaard uses subjectivity. It is something that is related to a subject, a person, an individual. An objective fact, he says, becomes true when it becomes related to a person by that person's choices and actions. The statement 2 + 2 = 4 is an objective fact. The statement someone got an F in the philosophy class may be another objective fact. But it would be a very different fact if the statement was you got an F in the philosophy class. The difference is whether a fact is related to you in a manner that means something to you. Facts such as 2 + 2 = 4 and Česká Budějovice is the administrative seat of the South Bohemian region of the Czech Republic probably have very little direct relation to you, so they don't mean much to you if they mean anything at all. When facts do relate to you, then you care about them, and they become subjective facts and a part of your conscious being. Consider also the difference between understanding in the objective abstract that cheating is wrong and actually deciding for yourself, I will not cheat. And someone could go through the motions of living an ethical life, but have no personal stake in it, no empathy for other people. Kierkegaard wanted to shift philosophy away from its focus on objective rationality to focus on the importance of individuals living their beliefs. Kierkegaard's Christianity was in keeping with that sentiment. Objective doctrine, meaningless. Genuine Christianity is subjective being, living a life of passionate inwardness. And again, we can apply that to religion, but it has a very real secular application as well, because it's not really about religion, but it is really about our life. Passionate inwardness, Kierkegaard says, is not selfishness, it's freedom. For Kierkegaard, an individual is free when he or she chooses his or her own path in life, and does so by putting themselves into it, by owning it, by being passionate about it. The free individual expresses his or her self-activated self, who he is or who she is, and what he or she does. We are, Kierkegaard says, beings who must choose and act. And it is only when we own those decisions that we become truly free, because it is only when you can put your passion into this, put yourself into your decisions and your actions, that you are truly doing anything. Otherwise, you are just going through the motions. Yes, you can believe the same as others do, but if you believe and do things only because you think you are supposed to, this is a false belief. True belief is when you're committed to that belief as your own. You have to own your own decisions. Anything less is to not be human. And maybe, as Kierkegaard believed, we need to ask God, what sort of person have you created me to be? But even without the idea of a God informing us, creating us to be a certain way, we can still look at our lives, at our decisions, as being ours, as being meaningful. The point being, as Kierkegaard very correctly points out, you cannot escape the freedom and responsibility of being a being who makes choices and acts on your choices. You will interpret everything that happens to you through your beliefs and values. You choose your own beliefs and values, whether you, or not you do that consciously or not, whether you do it actively or not. If you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. So your life and who you are is your creation, and therefore your responsibility. So own it. Choose to own your own life. Which leads us to the very similar and yet very different Friedrich Nietzsche. Popular culture talks a lot about Nietzsche, but as with most things, popular culture gets Nietzsche wrong. Totally wrong. Nietzsche was not a nihilistic anti-morality monster. Nietzsche was not a self-help, self-improvement guru. He also wasn't the hostile bigot that some people portray him as. He wasn't the godless atheist hero that some portray him as. Nietzsche was cynical, yes, but this was the cynicism of the idealist, of one who believes that life and society can be better than they are. And Nietzsche was bitterly disappointed that they are not. Nietzsche's negativity was primarily a despair over how people throw their lives away on false and harmful beliefs. Nietzsche thought about beliefs in a manner similar to Kierkegaard's thinking. Like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche downplayed the importance of rational, objective truth and elevated the personal and subjective. And what Nietzsche said, putting in very philosophical, rational terms, is that We can deal with objective facts, but only when we understand that that's not what's real. Our own personal perspective on things, our subjectivity, is what is real. Nietzsche wrote, in opposition to positivism, which halts at phenomena and says, there are only facts and nothing more, I would say, no. Facts are precisely what is lacking. All that exists consists of interpretations. We cannot establish any fact in itself. It may even be nonsense to desire such a thing. There are no facts, Nietzsche says. There are only interpreted facts, interpreted truths. The idea of objective facts, completely uninterpreted by subjective perception, is a fantasy. We never encounter such facts. That is impossible because you cannot have an experience without it being your experience. All we have are perspectives. Everything that is experienced by all human beings is experienced through that person's particular perspective. And those perspectives are unavoidable because they are all we have. Now, all of these perspectives, in one sense, are false if you compare them to this fantasy of objective truth. And this is how it works in Nietzsche's conception. He says, there is only a perspective seeing, only a perspective knowing. Each individual, because he or she is such an individual, has a different perspective on things, on experiences, on objects in the world, on themselves. And because ultimately any individual has only their own ideas in their minds caused by their sense impressions, their experiences of the world, that means that each individual thinks about and communicates to others only his or her own ideas. You have experiences. You interpreted those experiences, and you interpret those experiences based upon your past experiences and the values you have chosen. When Nietzsche says there are no facts in themselves, he means that an interpretation must always be projected onto ideas before they become facts for an individual. Individuals are thus creators of their own facts. They can't help it. We can't help it. There's no other way to live. There's no other way to exist. It's what human minds do. And we can see here how Nietzsche was influenced by Kant. Kant said that the mind is active and it contributes to our experiences. And Nietzsche says, that's true. Here's the implications of that. We can't avoid the fact that objective truth is a fantasy. Facts are created by individuals. And those facts may or may not be true, in that they may not be true depictions of the world. Actually, they most certainly aren't. Nietzsche would say that because what an individual thinks and feels is a product of his or her mind, everything is perspective, even science, physics too. It's only an interpretation and belief about the world. Nietzsche insists on this, and he's been shown time and time again to be true, because science keeps changing its perspective on the world, its beliefs about the world. And if you don't believe that, because you are so enamored with science, remember the difference between Newtonian mechanics, Einsteinian relativity, and quantum mechanics. Science changes because interpretations change. Everything is perspective. Now, Nietzsche says we should embrace this because what's the alternative? Ignoring our existence, ignoring our reality, ignoring what is really true for us, which is only perspectives exist. We have to interpret the world by means of a perspective. It's the basic condition of human existence. Kierkegaard talked about how we are beings who must choose and act. And Nietzsche says that we are beings who must make interpretations based upon our own perspectives. Maybe our ideas are false. Maybe all of our words are lies because they are mere perspectives that do not perfectly depict reality itself. But these ideas are useful, and they have to be because it's all we have. Our perspectives create a world that is calculable, simplified, and comprehensive for us. When we are armed with this new perspective on truth and how it functions in the world, we can move beyond tradition and forge a new path. Nietzsche says that whether we want it or not, we must forge that new path because the old ways are dying, if not already dead.